Anyway, thank you for that warm introduction. It is great to be here with all of you. And again, I apologize that I need to leave early. I was invited just a week or two ago to speak at the House Innovation Caucus and do a congressional briefing. And I'm going to give them a version of some of the same comments I'm making here along the lines of if they don't fix some of the barriers to innovative payment, they're going to see barriers to access and people will die and there will be problems. So I've got a strong message to share with them that I think everybody here would agree with. So I come to you as a representative of a payer and just a little bit about where I come from and what our concerns are. So first of all, I don't need to tell you all that these are incredibly innovative treatments that we want for ourselves and our loved ones. So in many cases, and certainly based on the data I've seen in maybe the majority of cases for those that come to market, it's not a question of should we create barriers to these. We should of course make sure they get to the right patient at the right time. But the question is how do we pay for them in a way that we don't see artificial barriers based on cost. And again, our insurance system is, as you all know, is not designed for one-time, very, very large payments. So if you think about the challenges of being an insurer, if we see a lot of upfront expenses, these balloons, and we saw that with Hep C where there was a lot of mixed responses, including some restrictions that in many cases have gone away, but that was unfortunate at the time, and those were all about cost. If you think about it, the presence of that cost spike increases premiums. Insurers don't like it when premiums go up because their customers don't like it. And certainly in many of the markets we serve, individual, small, and even mid-sized group, they're exquisitely sensitive to price. And if we are a few dollars more per month than other insurers, people won't buy us. And they look at that even more than they look at the deductible or the cost share or whatever. So there's a lot of pressure on the payers. On the other hand, these are likely to be transformative, and as I mentioned, they are things we should want to cover and do want to cover. So the question again is not how do we get away with not covering these, how do we pay for these without breaking the bank? And for a number of reasons that I think are obvious, the discussion is very much about paying over time. Maybe not forever, but for a set number of years subject to continuing durability. And that solves a couple of problems. First, it obviously solves a budget impact problem. Now, I will say that we do need a fair starting price, and again, that's controversial, particularly when organizations like ICER come out with assessments that companies don't agree with. But there's also evidence that when they come out with assessments that the companies do agree with, payers remove barriers and encourage access. So it is an opportunity. I'd also say about ICER, in support of what they're doing, that to me and someone in my role, they create a way to think about value other than upfront cost. And the last thing you want someone who's making policy decisions doing is reacting on the basis of price alone. Because sometimes a more expensive drug is a better value and has better outcomes. And if you're just having a knee-jerk response to a new drug has a higher price, so let's try to encourage people to use the older drug, you're probably not making the right decision. I care about the total cost of care. I care about value. What I don't care about and shouldn't care about is the cost of any one input, such as a drug. So last year, we spent about 1 out of every $4 on drugs of some type. That's not good or bad. That's a number. But if we see more innovative, transformative therapies that keep people out of the hospital and from decompensating and getting worse, maybe that number should be 30 or 35%. And if we're seeing that and we're improving value, avoiding long-term sequelae and hospitalizations, that's a good thing. So I think we probably agree with many things more than people would suspect. Now, in terms of the challenges, again, that upfront payment is a big problem for payers. We can figure out how to pay over time. That can solve a lot of the budget impact. There are drugs that may not have cost offsets, like the Spark drug. It's still clear we want to cover that. And just to be clear, there may be cost offsets. People may be more productive, need less help in the home. The way our system is set up here, if you're a private payer, because you don't pay for those things, the private payer doesn't have a way to reduce cost downstream, even though society may have that opportunity. But again, there's still no question we should cover that, and we do have an innovative payment model with Spark that I think is a model and a starting point for many others. In other cases, though, if you think about things like hemophilia, where we may be paying an average of $300,000 a year or so for hemophilic for factor, you can easily see how if you're paying over time in a way commensurate with durability and outcomes, you can really minimize the budget impact, and that's very exciting to those who are trying to make the system work. Another challenge is around unknown durability. So in many cases, drugs are being rushed to market, and for good reason, because there is a true unmet need, and as you heard, people are suffering, people are dying. We don't want to wait 10 years before we introduce these when we have 10-year data. On the other hand, one of the factors that goes into the pricing is the expected durability. So how do we balance those two? And clearly, one way to do that is through paying over time subject to continuing evidence of durability. And many of us are looking at 5-year or so agreements, which we think is reasonable. And again, there are challenges in the system that I'll talk about, but that seems like a good starting point. Again, one of the challenges out there that we haven't addressed, though, is what is the starting price. And I believe that as we see more of these coming to market, we see more pressure, not just with commercial payers, but with state and Medicaid plans, which I think are the canary in a coal mine, because they do operate with fixed budgets. I think there is going to be more pressure. So if I were going to give some advice to a company investing in these kind of therapies, I would say justify your price, show your work, show your math. You're going to come out with a number, be able to explain why it is fair value, and keep in mind that if a child goes into the hospital and has an appendectomy and we get another 70 years of life, we don't pay them 70 times 100 or 150,000 per quality adjusted life year and get to a very, very high number. So that is worth thinking about as well. On the other hand, payers and I think all stakeholders understand that drug discovery is risky business and that we want to continue to attract capital to this high-risk venture so that we see the next generation of gene therapies and advances. So it is a balancing act. On the durability side, some of the challenges that we're facing are as follows. First, Medicare best price, which is one of the points that many of us here are trying to bring to the attention of our regulators and legislators and get a fix. I think as people understand, if we were to be involved in a multi-year payment model, let's say 20% for each payment, and we stop paying after 2 payments because the drug stops working, that would be seen as a 60% discount. Right now, the maximum, the Medicaid, the statute suggests 23.1% and then 17.1% for purely pediatric drugs. So companies, understandably, are reluctant to provide those kind of guarantees if that would reset the price for the entire population. Again, the best price legislation and the rules never contemplated these kind of agreements. So it is something that is a barrier to innovation, and in the absence of which we still continue to partner with companies like Novartis, with Spark and others, but we're limited in the amount of risk that the companies will take. And the companies on their part, frankly, and Spark is an example where they've said we would take more risk if we were able to, and companies that are out there with future therapies, the Sareptas, the Bluebirds, et cetera, they're all saying the same thing. The patient advocacy groups are saying the same thing. They understand that to facilitate access to these life-saving treatments, they need to figure out how to pay over time in a way commensurate with value. So that is a big piece that needs to be fixed. I do speak with many people in CMS and HHS. I think they understand this. They're smart people. They're committed. That they get this. I think they're challenged also by the rules that they operate within. And the guidance recently has been work within the existing system, which is hard. I do think there will need to be change, and I think there's no force for change, like coming out with some high-cost therapies and showing the world that the current regulations are barriers. A second challenge is around outcome measures, and this is a tough one. How do we agree on what constitutes success, what constitutes failure? Does going back on an older drug mean that the drug isn't working as well? Is it binary, or are there intermediate steps? And this is where we frequently get into interesting discussions and have challenges getting to an agreement. And in many cases, people like myself, perhaps naively, go into the discussion believing that you should be willing to stand by the data that was taken to the FDA to get the drug approved. And I believe that philosophically, intellectually, it makes sense. What I'm told on more than one occasion is that the scales, the tools that were used to demonstrate success are pretty much only present in a research setting, and that it's not viable and not realistic to use those when you're going broader into the real world. So, we have some interesting discussions about what does constitute success or failure. And again, there are cases such as whether, again, adding a drug to the mix indicates that it isn't working as effectively as we'd like. In some cases, in many cases, the payers think that should lead to at least a lesser payment, and the companies, the manufacturers, believe not so much. It's your decision. But again, we're just going to go with the data in terms of that, and I think that may play out in a couple of near-term approvals in terms of what happens. I also think there are some opportunities here for innovation even beyond paying over time. For example, there are companies that have franchises in these areas. And one could see, and I've had some very early discussions with some of these companies, maybe the price does include existing therapy like factor. So one could see an agreement where we're paying a certain amount for gene therapy, paying over time, and if the company makes a gene therapy and makes other drugs, and again, factor would be an example for hemophiliac, perhaps a factor is included at no additional cost. And it's framed less as a failure and more as an outcomes guarantee in terms of whatever is needed to control that patient's bleeding. There's other innovation opportunities here as well. So I was in a discussion around sickle cell just last week with a group, and we were talking about the fact that for existing patients who are maybe in their 30s and 40s, they may have joint damage and other things. For those who are diagnosed early, newborns, for example, there's much greater value because you don't have that existing disease. And it raised the question, and it's an interesting one, do you actually have age-specific pricing? Now, you could overly complicate that, and I've been accused, particularly by the people who I work with, who I create a lot of work for, of doing so. But one could imagine that you had a price for those who are newborn or young and don't have any complications, and a second price for those who are older and do have complications. And again, that's a way to get around the question of, is the therapy fair value? Because in this case, it's clear that there are different value propositions for different groups. I'd encourage all of you to think about that as well. Other challenges, barriers, portability. So if we're trying to do multi-year agreements, how does that actually work in a system that is not single payer? And and that is, again, a real challenge that we need to address. And there's a couple of ways to get around that. One is, and if you think about what we did with Spark, and this is what we will do in the absence of any solutions, we'll enter into upfront agreements with some flow of dollars downstream, again, in many cases limited by Medicare best price, and agree that over time we will continue to be on the other end of that agreement, even if the patient leaves Harvard Pilgrim. Now that is not a great solution, but it is better than paying the entire amount up front with nothing at risk or no rebate for based on outcomes, et cetera, regardless of what happens. So that's something we can work around, but it's imperfect. There are discussions underway. I don't know if people are familiar with the MIT Nudix group. They met last week, and there's been a lot of discussion there about creating at least a test environment in Massachusetts where payers pretty much play well together. And it occurred to me about a year ago that if you define churn as leaving Harvard Pilgrim, it is a certain percentage. But if you find churn as actually moving out of the state, as opposed to having your employer or yourself go with a different insurer, it's far less. So the question was, could we come up with an agreement with the major commercial insurers for what might call an import-export agreement? We'll take your liabilities if you take ours. Let's agree on common measures and the like. So we've been having discussions. The major barrier to that is actually, not surprising, the Medicare best pricing, as well as some frustration among some of the payers around the outcome measures, since we need to agree on common outcome measures. We can't collaborate on price, although I think that really isn't a barrier, because I'm pretty sure the companies are going to come to us with a price that they're offering to everyone versus cutting individual deals. So I think that's doable, and a lot of people elsewhere are watching it, but the best price legislation is right now the biggest barrier to moving forward. In terms of other challenges beyond that, I will say that the fact that half the employers that we have are self-insured, and some of the larger payers actually have a higher percentage. They have issues around reinsurance, which I won't get into in details, but that may be a challenging solution for them as well, because I can't get all of the employers to agree to take the liabilities. So there's other models being talked about. I'll just briefly say one model that's been put out there is what some call an orphan benefit reinsurance model. Could be a third party, which is commercial. It could be some sort of government fund, but that's something where everyone could pay into it, perhaps on a PMPM to cover certain gene therapies, and that fund or company pays over time and negotiates these. That would get around the portability issues. You'd still have the best price challenges, but again, I think we're going to solve that. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to change things and to improve and to solve the barriers. But I do believe it's going to take a couple of launches and our ability to demonstrate to various stakeholders why these are issues and why they need to be solved. So I'll end my prepared comments there and open that up to questions. I'll take questions now since, again, I do need to leave midway through. So I'll take a couple of questions. Anything? Yes.
So about the portability, so when a patient moves and you're still paying, how do you follow up what the treatment is still working?
That's a great question, and it's one of those things that you think about in the abstract, and then when you start to put together an agreement, you think about that in a lot differently. And I was more concerned about that previously. We've done a lot of value-based agreements for many different drugs, and I used to think that they needed to be scalable, something we could get from a claim sheet. And I've changed my perspective on that. I think where we will get the most benefit, and the companies will get the most benefit, are for the high-cost therapies, the CAR-Ts, the gene therapies we're talking about here, rare diseases. And in those cases, many of the outcome measures may be a little challenging to get. However, if we have an agreement with a company for a $1.5 to $2 million or more therapy with a whole lot at risk, 60, 80%, whatever, I can have a staff member assigned to tracking down that patient, calling them, speaking to the physician, et cetera. So at least in the near term, where a lot of these are for less common conditions, that's doable. Second point I would make is that my understanding, you understand the FDA requirements better than I do, but my understanding is they're requiring for a number of years, I think at least 5, and I've heard numbers that are longer, for the gene therapy companies to collect data on the efficacy and safety. So it strikes me that if we're agreeing with the companies to certain outcome measures, just have the companies measure them, because they're going to have to track the patients. And then finally, there are some third parties, some large entities, and I think Steve Miller may touch on this, but there are a number of them that are putting together different entities that could help manage these and help the system work for many of the smaller payers and others that may not have the capacity or the human capital. So I don't think that's a deal breaker, but it's a great question. Other questions? Yes? Yeah, that's a great question. The question is, some of the other payers are less vocal, and how are they thinking about this? And again, we are kind of at the cutting edge. Sometimes we may be getting a little far over our skis, but we're out there. And let me give you a data point here. A couple of years ago, there was a lot of concern about the PCSK9s. Do people remember those high-cost cholesterol drugs? And I can't tell you how much time I spent and my colleagues spent looking at them, putting restrictions in place, modeling again, speaking to our CFO, and everyone kind of had Hep C hangover. Now, I will tell you that our current run rate on PCSK9s for our insured population is under $2 million a year. and again, it's going up with some outcomes data, and there's many reasons for that, which I won't get into now, that's likely to be less than the cost of one patient getting a gene therapy. So is it, should I be paying a lot of attention to these new therapies and coming out with innovative? Absolutely. I think the issue for many payers, though, is that they're all really busy, and like everyone, we can't keep up with the current demand to review new tests, molecular diagnostics, drugs, et cetera. So I think many companies are challenged. It's tough to get attention, and again, we find this interesting. We're very involved here, but for a typical payer, especially the smaller ones that don't have as much capacity. So if you're a large payer, you might have one or two people focused on this, but the smaller ones, which are many, many in terms of the number of payers, as smaller as a percentage of the population, again, just don't have the people to put on this. So they're less likely to meet with gene therapy companies and to model it out, and they're going to pay attention maybe when it's a few months out and they have to worry about the budget impact. But they're also watching companies like ours and Cigna Express Scripts and others, and I think they're taking their cue and figuring as long as someone's thinking about these, they'll be able to be a part of it. Even using that MIT Newdig's example, we were the primary payer at the table. When we kind of shook everyone up and said, would you join us and talk about how to do this? Two of the other larger commercial payers, actually so now we have all the three of the largest, came and said, we'll send someone, we'll talk about this. So when asked, they stepped up. And then the other two, the fourth and fifth in terms of size, and this isn't surprising, said, we're kind of busy, we don't really have time for this, but when you get traction and you're about to do something, give us a call and we'll join in and see what we can do.
Perfect. Could you mentioned, Michael, quality adjusted life years, and I was on a panel, as I mentioned earlier yesterday, and there was a bit of a discussion about their utility, the appropriateness of them. Apparently, Secretary Azar recently weighed in and said, look, I think they're perfectly fine in private plans where people can vote with their feet if they want to leave, but they're inappropriate in Medicaid and public plans because people can't leave. So just maybe you could unpack your thinking for us all on quality adjusted life years, their utility, the pluses and minuses of.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll try to do it somewhat briefly. I think there's 2 points embedded there. The one that answers the question less directly, but I think is important, I've heard that before in a meeting with Seema Verma about the fact people can move around among plans, but they can't move out of the public payer. It's still, it doesn't change the question about what is a fair price, because again, the Medicaid plans, which people may not be able to leave, they still have to cover the costs. And if we can't figure out a fair price, and this is all about getting, the whole discussion really is about imputing what is a fair starting price. And if we can't get there and that becomes a barrier to people getting drugs, that's a bad thing for everyone. And again, if you're in industry, if we can't solve this, there is the specter, and depends on what happens in the next election, of significant legislation. Right now we're seeing a lot of discussions around transparency and others. I testified in the Massachusetts State House recently, and some of the advocacy groups were pretty adamant, and even in cases where actually the pricing was fair. I was a little surprised some of the examples. You get some elderly individuals in talking about the cost share, and it's very compelling to the legislators. And in some cases, they were for drugs that actually ICER said is fair value. So I'm concerned about that, and I think you should all be more concerned. But the question more directly around how do you determine what is fair? As I said, a dollar number in itself is in a vacuum. I shouldn't be reacting to that. I should be thinking about what is the best way to get to high quality, what is the lowest cost way to get there in terms of total cost of care, and if the costs go up, what is the right slope that's fair for all parties? And the whole ICER approach is trying to get to that by, at an upper limit, suggesting that drugs that are priced at no more than $150,000 per quality adjusted life year, are fair. Now, one of the concerns that's been expressed, and this is a fair concern, is if you're talking about quality adjusted life years, in many cases, particularly for those who may not be newborns but may have some ongoing sequelae of the disease, you're not going to get a full quality adjusted life year. In other words, it's partial. And again, in some cases, these will slow progression but not ultimately get people to full health. So the question is, do qualities actually discriminate against those who are disabled? And again, it's not a crazy argument, it's a fair point. And for that reason, ICER, to their credit, and they've heard this from many of us, including myself, looked at what they're calling life year gained. So when they looked at that for example, Zolgensma, which just came out, the SMA gene therapy, the numbers that, and I'm going to give you the high end, was 1.5 million. It was actually 900,000 to 1.5 million per life year gained. If you use quality adjusted life years, you got a far smaller number because in many cases you're not getting kind of a 1.0 on the quality modifier. And I'm perfectly comfortable looking at the life years gained and saying let's not risk discriminating against individuals. Let's just look at it at flat life year gained. But again, it's important to use something like that to try to impute a fair price. Right now there's a small number of drugs, but again, we're looking at some indications which can be broader, and rare disease collectively aren't that rare. And we run the risk that in 5 years, 5 to 10 years, maybe not in 2 to 3, but 5 to 10, we'll see limits on our ability to spend, which may create other types of constraints. I think this is really important. Well, thank you, and I'll turn it over to them.
Wanted to ask
one
one
more
last question. Just if you could advise, I guess, the companies in the room, if they're interested in exploring outcomes-based payment arrangements, contracting strategies, when's the best time to come and engage with payers?
That is a great question, and I think to some extent it depends on the payers. And if you're talking about the larger entities, which again have more capacity, or the smaller ones like mine, which have shown a willingness to come to the table, probably earlier. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. If some of the many others that just may not have the capacity, that have 50 companies trying to meet with them, it's probably pretty close to FDA approval when they have data, and they can go to them to support the the development of a clinical policy, which the payers are interested in. For those of us who are kind of more on the innovative front end, we meet certainly, and again, we have capacity issues, so if we had 50 requests, we wouldn't be able to do this, and I tend to meet personally with companies where I have relationships and I know the people. Again, if you read the press, you think that payers and PBMs and pharma hate each other, and maybe some do, but when I sit down, there's good and bad actors, but when I sit down with the companies and they start to talk about what's important and the data, the unmet need, and the patients they're helping, you develop that common understanding and that shared true north, and you start working towards solutions. And that to me is a fun part of why I do what I do. But we sit down frequently with companies that are even 1 or 2 years out when they're asking what kind of data should we come to you, how do we think about multi-year agreements. In many cases there's companies, and I won't name them, but that we've had some interesting conflict with before over data that are now coming to us saying, we get that there's going to be challenges if we can't pay over multiple years. Help us think about it. How can we set up our infrastructure, our pilots, our data, so when we come to you, we'll be able to do this. So in that case, it could be in 1 to 2 years.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.